Oh no, the login failed. Maybe this whole code is just wrong. Moments like that happened a lot while building this web app, to say the least. For context, I volunteer at a nonprofit in the Baltimore area, and the leadership there realized that they needed an app to track youth participation and outcomes in their programs. My first thought was to build an app to address all the requirements of the team, something that could be easily accessible by the nonprofit or any other stakeholders online. So without fully knowing what I was doing, I jumped in. I have coding experience and have worked with game development and game design before, but web apps felt like uncharted territory to me. But I figured that I would cross that bridge once I got there. I started by creating a plan for the app, planning out what kinds of pages and features were needed, as well as what data types needed to be stored. For instance, there needed to be a way to store youth participant data, but also upload qualitative data such as notes and pictures to each participant profile. And after a bunch of Google searches, I decided to use Firestore database to store and manage all this data. But that still didn't change the fact that I hadn't developed a web app before and had barely any experience coding in JavaScript. My first thought to tackle this was to find an online YouTube course and follow along while integrating the features I needed to. But I ended up descending down a spiral of tutorials, trying to find code snippets or guidance on how to build a dashboard, for example, or have a login and authentication feature. I knew exactly what I wanted to do and how all the components of the app would interact with each other. I just didn't have the syntax for it. Then I remembered something. A while ago, while mindlessly scrolling on LinkedIn, a post had blessed my feed. It was a guide on coding a web app, leveraging modern software stacks, created by a college student majoring in artificial intelligence. Surely they must have a better idea of what they're doing in comparison to me, right? The guide suggested using Cursor, an integrated development environment that uses Claude, or Anthropic's AI assistant, to write code. I knew that I would use Node.js for the backend, Firebase to store this backend data, and React.js for. However, I truly didn't expect what would happen next when I used Cursor and Claude. I began by writing a pretty thorough technical description outlining all my thoughts and then fed that into Cursor. Of course, Cursor costs money, so I got a free trial, which meant that I had a time constraint to develop this. Brilliant. Of course, there were some initial hurdles even before the coding had begun, such as ensuring that I had ironed out all the essential details and that I had all the necessary API keys to configure Firebase and other services such as Cloudinary for image upload. Working on Cursor, I asked the assistant to start programming the backend, defining controllers and routes for various functions such as authentication, and creating data models for the app components. Then came the front end, which is honestly a process of trial and error. Cursor built out the pages with the descriptions I gave, and I tested them out, telling the AI assistant what needed to be changed. I made some edits to the code, but in no way was I starting from scratch. There was already something mostly functional sitting in front of me. The only challenge was being as specific as possible when talking to the AI assistant and clearly communicating what I wanted the web app to look like. As I sat back and watched the AI assistant add and delete lines of code, doing the tedious heavy lifting I myself wasn't sure I was capable of, I couldn't help but feel like I was cheating at this whole programming thing. Just 3 years ago, when I was a junior in high school, none of this would have been possible. I would never use AI to develop a first draft for a blog post, for example. So what made this different? With programming, the implementation is pretty tedious, but usually if I want an app to have a certain function, there's a certain piece of code needed for that function. Why do a bunch of reading to figure out that particular piece of code when I can have a starting point to work off from? The design and making a nice user interface, that human-centered part, comes afterward. But creativity, on the other hand, is a lot more open-ended. Writing and making art has a unique sense of voice that large language models cannot give a starting point for. So eventually, once all the features were built out, I got to the part where I had to deploy the app to the web using Vercel. And for some reason, this was the hardest part of the process. Everything worked locally on my computer, but for some reason, the front end wasn't connecting to the back end URL. I spent hours and hours trying out different deployments and then realized that I was going in circles and that I needed to step back and take a break and do some reading and troubleshooting to figure out what was wrong. And I'm still in the process of figuring this out, actually. Well, now here's the finished web app. This is honestly such an interesting journey, and through lots of iterating and Google searches, I learned a lot about the process of building a web app and what goes into developing a backend and front end. I don't have a lot of computer science experience. I'm not a CS major or a CS minor for that fact, but there's a lot of tools in place to help build the necessary knowledge and implement code, given that a solid idea is there. When I was a high school sophomore taking AP Computer Science, this is before ChatGPT came out, by the way, my computer science teacher always said that when it comes to programming and developing a product, it's the idea that counts. And I really felt that here. When I wasn't sure about the code, it was the concept and logic behind the web app that I was building, which took a lot of time and thinking to develop, that helped me get to where I needed to be. So maybe, in the age of generative AI, the world belongs to those who can clearly define and communicate the idea. Anyways, that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching, and if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe. Bye-bye, and see you in the next one.